Your story is fascinating. So let's just like dive right into it. How did you go from pastor to researcher at the cutting edge of psychedelic medicine?
Well, they're not necessarily in sequence. So right as I got my first appointment in psychiatry as a faculty, I became an assistant professor. I was also asked to be a lay pastor for my local congregation, and I did that for about 5.5 years. And so it wasn't, one and then the other, but they were both going on at the same time.
Well, how would you, if you could step back, how are the two related? Like, was your interest in spirituality related to, this psychedelic conquest and the science surrounding it? Where did those two interests come from?
Yeah. Let's take one of them at a time. So psychedelics, that's an interesting term. And sometimes it's good to just kind of define what we mean by that. Most of my work, my academic work in what might be termed psychedelics has involved ketamine, which is an anesthesia medicine that has been around for a long time. More recently, I say in the last 25 years, it was noted that at lower doses, it could produce fairly rapid and profound antidepressant effects. Some people would not necessarily classify ketamine as a psychedelic, depending on how you define the term. That is where so much of my work in academics has started. And part of this just had to do with the fact that I was at Yale, where so much of this research was going on. This is kind of where it was first discovered that ketamine at lower than normal doses for anesthesia could produce really profound antidepressant effects. And one of the things that had been so interesting to me is the way that ketamine, as well as many of our treatments, seem to induce this kind of state of enhanced plasticity. And I'm using a lot of terms. I'll try to describe what that means, but plasticity is the brain's ability to adapt to different circumstances. When I try to explain this to some of my family and friends who are not in medicine, I use this analogy of wet cement. So when I was a kid, I was born in Utah. I grew up for the first 7 years of my life in Utah, and when my parents, they redid the patio, they let my siblings and I write our names in the wet cement. And so, of course, when it hardens, that structure stays, and you can look back and see your name and whatever stick figures you drew in the cement as a 5-year-old kid. And this is a little bit what this might be like. So the ketamine can make the cement wet, but you also want to kind of shape and mold it so that when it kind of hardens, it's in the shape that you want it to be.
Yeah.
Right. So one of my interests has been in combining ketamine with talk therapy, or the talk therapy that I'm most familiar with and have used most in this setting is cognitive behavioral therapy. So you're making the cement wet. You're making the cement wet, and then you're shaping it into the way that you want it to kind of last, so that you can kind of harness those long-term potential gains and help people who have struggled with depression for a long time to be well for as long as they can.
Wow. And you're working with adults primarily, right?
Primarily adults.
So you're like re-wetting the cement, right?
Correct. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I didn't realize that Yale was the epicenter where all this like ketamine research is happening.
So the chair of my department, John Crystal, was on one of these first studies that showed that just a single dose of this can lead to profound and in some ways long-lasting effects. So most of our traditional treatments, right, things like SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, fluoxetine or Prozac, you take them every day, whereas just a single dose of ketamine, it produced effects that lasted well beyond the time that the drug was in the body. So ketamine is a very short-lasting compound. It stays around your body maybe just a couple of hours, but the effects from that initial study seemed that they lasted about a week.
Wow.
And so this was kind of a paradigm shift, because up to that point, there wasn't really a sense that there was such a thing as a rapid acting antidepressant. A lot of people have said, well, it took a long time for people to get into this hole, and so it's going to take a long time for us to help them dig out of this hole. Wow. And, this has been a real paradigm shift in psychiatry to kind of even conceptualize that we can do things maybe quicker than we had originally thought we could.
I mean, it's revolutionary. A short-acting antidepressant that after a single dose has enduring effects and doesn't come with all of the side effects that traditional pharmacotherapy usually entails.
That's true. The caveat, of course, is that pretty much every medicine has side effects. So ketamine does have side effects. They're different, and this needs to be done in a way that it is safe and controlled and so forth. So in 2019, the FDA approved a form of this therapy called S-ketamine. It approved it for widespread use in what is called treatment-resistant depression. So this is not a medicine that I would recommend to a first-timer. Someone who's like, I've been depressed. This is the first time I've been depressed. I've never tried any other therapies. Let me try Special K. Sorry, that is not what I would consider the appropriate use of this. If you have tried other forms of therapy, talk therapy, medications, a couple of different of these approaches, and it has not worked, and you're still struggling, suffering, then would be the appropriate time to ask a question: should I look into ketamine?
So maybe it's not a suitable first line of...
No.
Like, you would want to try all the sort of the lifestyle, the therapy, the all that stuff. But would you say that it should be tried probably prior to anyone, one of these drugs that you have to take on a more consistent basis? And also, by the way, a lot of these SSRIs are really difficult to come off of.
Yes. So it is designed to be taken after you've tried some of those traditional therapies. Certainly the lifestyle things, those can be really helpful, but in many cases they're not all that a patient needs. So
why after? Like, why not start with? I'm just curious. Why not start with that?
Well, part of it has to do with the risk profile. So ketamine is a drug of abuse in some areas of the world. It's not so common here in the U.S., but in some areas like Southeast Asia, it's maybe the number one or number two drug of abuse. Okay, wow. So we want to be really careful. Medicine has a history, unfortunately, of introducing things that have therapeutic effects and maybe also causing harm because they have addictive potential as well. Things, the opioid crisis that we're in the midst of now, that has part of the history is tied to medicine. Opioids can be really helpful as pain relievers. And originally, opioids were really only given to people who were terminally ill with cancer. And then, slowly but surely, and especially when you had a corporate incentive to make these drugs more widely available, then, this is one of the reasons that we're living in this crisis of the opioid epidemic. So that's one reason that I think there's appropriate caution around not using this as like the first medication that you would take. Another thing has to do with the fact that there is a threshold above which this is not good for your brain, and we know that because of people who will abuse this recreationally, misuse this, and they'll take it every day at high doses or like 4 or 5 times a week. And after a period, say, of a year, these patients have, as far as we can tell, irreversible problems in memory and thinking.
Ooh.
So that's not good.
That's not good.
Right? So for a variety of reasons, we think that, the risk profile, even though this does have profound potential, antidepressant potential, the risk profile is elevated compared to things like fluoxetine, sertraline, and so forth. The most common complaints that we have for those drugs are patients can have, depending on the drug, can have weight gain. Sometimes it's just 5 or 10 pounds. With other therapies like antipsychotics, which also have antidepressant effects, that can be more profound, and you can have quite a bit of weight gain. Also sexual dysfunction. So those are the two most common complaints that we get with a lot of our traditional oral antidepressants that we prescribe for
suicidal
patients.
ideation too occurs in a small subset.
Well, that's a good question. It's a complicated history. That seems to be and it's somewhat still controversial, meaning that they're very smart people kind of on both sides, in teenagers and young adults. So, age ranges from teenage up to maybe 25. That data comes from the clinical trials that were part of the FDA process for approving a lot of these medicines, that some patients reported that in the first couple of days of starting antidepressants that they had more suicidal thoughts, or it's tricky because as far as I'm aware, there was no increase in suicide death, risk of suicide death. And so you want to be careful and certainly inform patients that, hey, look, in these first couple of days, we're going to monitor you more closely because there may be some increased risk of increased suicidal thoughts in these first few days of therapy. But over the long term, we think that the risk is going to be lower. And so we think this is the way to go. So, in fact, the form in which ketamine, this FDA-approved version of ketamine, is approved, it is intended to be taken alongside a traditional antidepressant. Okay. So, look, our therapies, they're not perfect. When we still have a long way to go. This is, I spend most of my time conducting clinical trials and trying to find better treatments and revise the treatments we have to make them better. In part because, we know we've got a long way to go. There is still a lot of hope, though, and many of these therapies can be profoundly life-changing.
It's so interesting. I mean, ketamine has certainly entered the cultural zeitgeist, at least here in California, where people are now starting, I think, to become aware of its therapeutic use. Prior to it being used therapeutically for depression, what was it? It was like used in veterinary medicine, was it not?
It has been used in veterinary medicine, but it was first designed for humans. So some people think that, it was, this is a horse tranquilizer. What am I going to, it may be used in that case, but it was originally designed for humans. It was developed in the 1960s by a pharmaceutical company to put patients to sleep while they had, surgical procedures. And actually the precursor to this was actually phencyclidine, or PCP, which is commonly referred to as angel dust. So the many of the same workers who later developed ketamine, they developed this phencyclidine PCP compound. They said, whoa, people get crazy on that. We can't use that. And so they toned it down a bit. They toned the potency, the place it acts in your brain down, and they came up with ketamine. And so ketamine was approved by the FDA for anesthesia in 1970. And if you remember from your history books, what was going on around that time was the Vietnam War. And because this is different than a lot of anesthesia medicines in that it does not necessarily reduce a patient's blood pressure or heart rate, it can be used in what's called field or battlefield medicine more safely than a lot of our other anesthetic medicines. And so it was used quite commonly, and still is quite commonly used in settings where you're not in a hospital, but you need to anesthetize a patient to do some sort of surgical procedure, maybe reset their bone or something like that. And so it is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines today for its anesthesia effects.
What excites you about the future of ketamine therapy?
Well, right now, I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is trying to make sure that we practice in a safe framework. So, ketamine clinics, and that term, some of my colleagues especially don't like that term, but they are a thing, and there's some nuance between the FDA-approved version of this and the non-FDA-approved version of this, which are very similar, but the FDA-approved version of this has to be prescribed within a very constrained framework, and there's a purpose behind that, and it does, I think, it enhances to the safety of society and the patients that are getting it. The ketamine clinics, some of them are, I think most the docs there are trying to help patients, but some of them get outside the kind of the framework, and we're trying to think of ways to help encourage doctors to make sure they're using this within the the evidence base that exists, and not maybe going too high on dose or too frequently on the administration of this. Because again, it's known that above a certain threshold, this is not good for your brain, and it's going to lead to irreversible problems in thinking and memory and so forth. And so we want to stay below that threshold, below it.
Is that threshold like a specific dose or a frequency of use?
It's both. As far as we can tell, it's both. So if you were to use ketamine, 4 or 5 times a week at anesthetic level doses, that would not be good. Okay. At the doses that it's been tested in the FDA approved protocols, that's twice a week for the first month. Then after that, it's once a week or less frequently, and at a specified dose. So now we have long-term data on about 1,000 patients, some of whom have been getting this treatment about once a week or once every other week for sometimes several years, that do not show concerning effects on cognition and some of the other problems that we were worried about when this kind of ketamine story first started to unfold.
Yeah, I mean, it is worrying considering there are a lot of people today using it recreationally, which I don't think. I mean, I haven't been made aware of these risks.
Yeah.
And I'm sure most people who are using it recreationally are not aware of those risks. So that's definitely startling.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this is why it's just important for those of us who are in this area to do our best to try and communicate to the public. Like, okay, this is what the science, the evidence shows. This is where you're safe. This is probably where you want to stay away from getting into this realm of unknowns and possibly, risks.
Yeah. What resources exist for people that want to learn more about its potential therapeutic use?
Well, it's kind of dry reading, but the FDA label, the FDA approved label for esketamine has, that's intended to be written for clinicians. I have a blog on psychologytoday.com, and I'm in the process of unfolding a series of parts on ketamine and trying to make this in a language that the everyday patient can understand and use and know. So, Up to Date is a resource that sometimes you have to subscribe to that, sometimes you don't. In my employer, in my network, I get access. I'm not sure if that's broadly accessible, but it's called Up to Date Online, I think, and they have patient resources for those who are interested in not just ketamine, but all sorts of medical topics.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important because we are in the midst of a mental health crisis.
Yes, we are.
Can you speak to that? I mean, the statistics around, people are struggling with unprecedented levels of depression, anxiety, stress, sleep problems. I mean, you name it.
Yeah. How long you got? I mean, there's a lot of factors that are at play here. Certainly, technology, for all its benefits, it does have some drawbacks, and particularly in teenagers and young adults, the advent of smartphones and social media and so forth have coincided very closely in time with a kind of surging wave of depression and anxiety among young people. And this seems particularly pronounced for teenage girls. That there's lots of potential ways that this happens. Part of it likely has to do with the fact that on Facebook you put your best face forward, and so everyone's thinking, oh, everyone else looks beautiful and I'm look terrible, that sort of thing. Teenage girls seem particularly susceptible to this what I sometimes call the demon of social comparison, and in as much as these cell phones and social media apps and so forth take away from our in-person interaction, it's not surprising to me that they are associated with worsening depression and anxiety. The biggest factor, and I know you've had Arthur Brooks and a number of experts on, the biggest factor in our happiness and well-being, and I'm glossing over quite a bit of data here, but is relationships, is the way that we interact with other human beings. That is what grounds us. That is what leads to meaning and satisfaction and so forth in an enduring way. And, the social media apps, they kind of give us a glimpse of that, but a lot of people use this metaphor, and I think it's an apt one, of social media is like junk food, right? It tastes good, but it doesn't necessarily have lasting kind of emotionally rewarding value, and there is truth to that. And so, in as much as people are replacing their in-person interactions with online interactions, it's not good. I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom here. Certainly these things, they're wonderful technologies, and in COVID, thank goodness for the ways that we could interact on Zoom and so forth with colleagues and family who are far away. Much of my family lives in the West, although my wife and our 5 children, we live in the Northeast. We can have a monthly Zoom or something like that, and the cousins and stuff can all see each other. It's great in some ways, but like pretty much every technology, there's ways to use it properly and ways that it can be used in a way that can be harmful to us.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It's like fire. Fire can either burn you or cook your food.
Yes.
Yes. It's it is an interesting it's a problem, and it's definitely something that we need more research to fully understand. It's interesting that you said young girls are particularly affected. We've had a brilliant expert on the podcast recently who shared that that young boys are actually at higher risk of suicide. So I wonder how this data, parses out, and it makes me wonder, like, are girls more, willing to report how it is that they're feeling, that they're more, prone to depression and anxiety, and, maybe boys tend to underreport it, and at the end of the day are more likely to push themselves to one of these more drastic and unfortunate measures. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are definite sex differences in the experience of mental illness and suicide risk and so forth. The notion that boys, as well as men, males in general, they are at higher risk for suicide. In the United States, however, women are more at risk for attempted suicide. And some of this just goes back to the fact that there are biological and psychological sex differences. Men are generally a little bit more willing to take risks. And so when they do attempt, and again, this is very, I know it's a morbid topic, it's a difficult topic, but when they do attempt, they tend to be more likely to use lethal means and things that are not going to, lead to what we call in jargon a non-fatal suicide attempt, or a suicide attempt where someone actually survives. So that's a well-known fact in psychiatry. Men are more likely to die by suicide. Women in general are more likely to attempt suicide. Women are more likely to experience depression and anxiety. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you have 100 patients with depression in my clinic that I'm treating, on average, about 66 of them are going to be women and 33 are going to be men, and that's fairly well replicated and known. Some of this might be due to the fact that women are more likely to talk about their feelings, report, and so forth. There's this kind of the stoic sense that you sometimes get. A man's place in society is to be stoic, not show emotion, be strong, and so forth. That might be some of it. I do think there probably is also, though, and some of this may have roots in our evolution, that women seem to be more sensitive to negative emotion. And I think that part of this has to do with, in the not too distant past, that they were kind of and in many households these days, the primary caretaker of these young children. And so if they're not able to notice a negative emotion of the young child, then that's not a good thing in terms of the overall survival of the species and so forth. So I think there is good psychological data to suggest that for better and for worse, women tend to be more sensitive to negative emotion. I think this kind of leads to this imbalance that we see in the clinic, where most of our patients are women.
This is illuminating. Wow. Yeah. Well, talk to me about the topic of your new book, Purpose, which
Sure.
Is fascinating. You bridge together, evolution with morality and our greater purpose in life, which I think is a fascinating topic. And you make connections in the book that haven't been made previously. So I'm excited to get into it. Yeah. So why do you write it, and what is the central thesis?
Yeah, it's got a couple theses, but I will try to get to them in due order. I wrote this book. I decided to write this book when I was a medical student. So this is before I even decided to go into psychiatry. I had the fortune to attend a wonderful university, Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore. And for whatever reason at this time, in my first few months of medical school, I kind of fell into this, what you might call an existential crisis. What I was learning about science and biology and evolution, anatomy and so forth, seemed to be at odds with the sense that I had, that all of us have, most of us have, that life has purpose, value, and meaning. And, there's this great quote I love. I laugh at now, but it was it was not comfortable at the time, of a scientist who says, look, in the profound march of evolution, life is of, the utmost unimportance. We are a mere, eddy in the primeval slime. And, I laugh at that now, but at the time I was like, are we really is our existence really just an accident? And so forth. And I went through this period of several months where I was kind of wrestling and struggling and studying and reflecting. And I'm a religious person. I was praying a lot and trying to figure out, what is life really just an accident? Or are we, just doomed to whittle away our hours in a lifeless and meaningless universe that is cold and indifferent? And I came to a conclusion that I think this was maybe me projecting more onto what the science actually says. And I wrote this book to provide a framework where, to me, actually they're mutually reinforcing. The sense of purpose and meaning that we have, I think it can be reinforcing with what we know about biology and psychology and ourselves, and maybe even our place in the universe.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think oftentimes it feels as though we are just clothed apes. But, the fact that there are so many, poles to the human experience, which you talk about in the book, I think is really interesting, and that every moment we do have ultimately a choice between doing good and doing evil.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that was off-putting to me about the theory of evolution is what I thought it implied about human nature. Okay. So sometimes when we talk about evolution, there's this phrase that comes up, survival of the fittest. You've probably heard about that. Biologists tend not to use that term so much these days. They prefer the term natural selection, but it is an instructive phrase because I think most people intuitively understand what we mean when we say survival of the fittest. And so my original understanding was that, look, if evolution is true and is responsible for our coming into existence, then we're just selfish, we're aggressive and greedy and so forth. And is that really human nature? There's a book by this biologist, Richard Dawkins. You may know him. Probably his most famous book called The Selfish Gene. And in the opening pages, he essentially states, look, if you're trying to build a good society where people interact generously and cooperatively, you're not going to get any help from biology because we are born selfish. Okay. Now that book was first published in the 1970s. I'm not sure what Dawkins would say now, but it's much more complicated than that. And there's lots of nuances and details to this. I won't get into all of them, but I think one of the best ways to understand this issue is to refer to what some biologists will call the levels of selection. And what that means is, so you have this phrase, survival of the fittest, and you turn it into a question. So survival of the fittest what? Is it survival of the fittest individual, or maybe a survival of the fittest family or group? And when we look into it, that issue of the level of selection has profound implications for the social and behavioral traits that emerge. So let me try to illustrate this with a story. So 1864, okay, coincidentally the same year that this phrase survival of the fittest comes into existence, there are two shipwrecks that happen at the same time and place. This is a story that I borrowed from a colleague of mine at Yale, Nicholas Christakis. So these shipwrecks occur at what are called the Auckland Islands. This is a group of islands about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. And the islands are sufficiently large that the survivors of the shipwreck never bump into one another. They never knew of each other's existence. Now, the first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. And after about 18 months, this harrowing ordeal and much resourcefulness and ingenuity, all of the crew from Musgrave's ship survived. They actually found their way off the end. They made a dinghy and traveled about 300 miles through the ocean waves to New Zealand. The second ship was led by a man named George Dalgarno, and unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died. Okay, so what was the key difference? Well, Musgrave's group, they formed a remarkably cohesive and cooperative group. They worked together. And this was epitomized really just in the first minutes or hours of the shipwreck when Musgrave himself, he carried an injured man on his back as he swam to the shore. Okay. On the other hand, Dalgarno's group, they kind of have adopted an every man for himself approach. And this was seen in the first days of their ordeal when they left a wounded man behind to die on the shore as they searched further inward for food and other resources. So, you can imagine a lot of scenarios similar to that in our evolutionary past where it wasn't selfishness, but cooperation and altruism that led to enhanced chances for survival. There probably are some contexts where selfishness was helpful. And I don't think I can argue. It doesn't take long to look back through the history book of humanity that we indeed have a selfish capacity in our nature, in our species, in mankind. But at the same time, history is also full of moral heroes, many of which are unsung, but nonetheless, have behaved in ways that are incredibly, heart-wrenching and altruistic and cooperative and so forth. So the way I see it is that the way that evolution has shaped us has left us pulled in different directions. We all have capacities for selfishness, right? A trending kind of phrase today is, narcissism. Am I going to end up with a narcissist or something in a relationship? And in some ways that label can be helpful, but all of us have a little bit of that in us, right? Of course. And it can get in the way of our personal relationships and in the way of our happiness if we're not careful. But at the same time, we have, I think, a very deep capacity to be concerned about others, to put others' needs before our own, and so forth. So you have this, there's this kind of cliche metaphor, right, of a man say, you used to see this in the cartoons all the time. A man walking down the street, and he has a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other shoulder. And I think in a real way, that's maybe closer to reality than we might realize.
Is altruism a uniquely human characteristic?
No, it's not.
It's not.
Yeah.
Do other animals display
yes.
what might be
it's
interpreted as altruism?
Yes, they do. So probably one of the best examples are what are sometimes called eusocial creatures or caste insects. So ants, honeybees. They have these immense networks, and this was actually one of the things that troubled Darwin initially. He said, this could this could be the fatal flaw in my theory. He was like, how do these honeybees? I don't quite understand it, because in a honeybee hive, you have one queen. Okay, you have about a couple hundred male, we call them drones. Okay, and then you have about 50 or 60,000 worker honeybees that are female, and they are sterile. Okay, so they can't reproduce. And so Darwin was puzzled, like, how would nature come up with this? If survival and reproduction is so critical, then why are these worker honeybees toiling so much if they're not going to be able to reproduce? This is in a biological sense, this is an extreme form of altruism. They're spending all their lives working for the hive when they're not going to be able to reproduce. Well, the trick is that it goes back to this level of selection. So is it survival of the fittest honeybee? Was it survival of the fittest hive, right? And both come into play in certain interactions, and they share their genes with their sister, the queen, and so these social dispositions do get passed on. So that was the, in a way, this issue of level of selection, what allowed Darwin to say, okay, no, this does work. We just need to always consider what is the level of selection, level of analysis that we're thinking about here? So there is lots of cases of altruism in non-human creatures.
Wow. So in terms of our evolution, do you think that survival of the fittest most do you think that in terms of human evolution, does that most, I think, would you say it most applies to the individual, or do you think that we're really hardwired in a sense to look out for one another, particularly in light of all the data suggesting that it's really like our relationships, right, that help to promote longevity and increased health span and the like?
I think it's both, right? And I think this is one of the reasons that, human nature has been such a quagmire for philosophers and social scientists for a long time. The age-old question, are we selfish? Are we altruistic? You know what? We're both. Okay, we have the capacity to be both. And there's certain contexts that tend to elicit one kind of aspect of our nature more than the other. Human nature is just so interesting because in many ways we are the most cooperative. But in other ways, we can also be the most aggressive. So let's talk about aggression really quickly. When you look at, say, as they call them, non-human primates, there's lots of ways to classify aggression. One way is to break it up into what you might call reflexive or kind of hot aggression. Okay, this is you get mad, heat of the moment, road rage, that sort of thing. But there's also a more kind of deliberate and premeditated or cold aggression. This is, premeditated murder, that sort of thing. War, right? War is almost always an example of, okay, you don't just go to war because you're in a rage. You have to plan, you organize, that sort of thing. So we have relatively low levels of reflexive aggression or hot aggression. And we still have some, but like compared to chimpanzees and so forth, we are much lower in our reflexive aggression than chimpanzees. But we probably have the highest level of premeditated or cold aggression. There's an anthropologist named Sarah Hrdy who has a great kind of thought experiment to help kind of drill this home. Suppose, she says, you were trying to board a plane with 200 chimpanzees. Okay, trying to get 200 chimpanzees on this, metal tube we know as an airplane. You would be lucky if you left with like all 10 fingers and toes. You'd be bloody earlobes all over the place and so forth. But fortunately, in human society, this happens thousands of times a day, mostly without any problem. But when you think about boarding an airplane, what do you do before that? You go through an intense security process that is meant to prevent the more rare but more deadly form of premeditated aggression. You don't have to think that hard to come up with examples of 9/11 and so forth, where that type of aggression is deadly. And so on the one hand, we have this very, very low form of reflexive aggression. We don't have zero, but we also have this very, very high form of premeditated or organized aggression that most commonly manifests itself in war. And so human nature is just full of these paradoxes.
Well, war, right? You could argue is in a way an act of altruism. I mean, I think it's like misdirected, right? But it's like if you're going to war in the name of your country, right? Like at least for the soldier, right? They think that they're performing an act of altruism, right?
Well, yeah. This gets into this really interesting area of human psychology that some people think that altruism and war are closely connected, and that the development of war is in part what led to our species becoming altruistic, and it has to do with what psychologists call in-group and out-group bias. And this notion that we have, probably most of us without even thinking, we have the tendency to consider ourselves as part of groups. And, some of these groups can be based on religion, political affiliation, your profession, that sort of thing. They can be fairly arbitrary. And we tend to treat those who we consider part of the group very different than we treat those who are out of the group. And in some ways, this is a depressing aspect of human nature. Some would say, well, say back in the Cold War, when we were, at Cold War with the USSR, there's some political scientists who say that the Democrats and Republicans got along so much better when we had an external enemy, right? This is because we redefined the group to be, okay, it's the U.S. versus, it's no longer Democrats versus Republicans, it's the U.S. versus communism. And so we're going to get along together a little bit better so that we can defeat our common enemy. There is some truth to that. The encouraging part, though, however, is that the way we define a group is very, very flexible. And so you can, in theory at least, continue to draw your circles larger and larger and larger and say, look, let's emphasize our shared humanity. And that just draws in, as large a circle as possible and try and consider everyone as just part of our group, of a shared, humanity.
Why do you think there's so much in-group fighting today here in the United States? I mean, today, like we're almost on people have spoken of, this so-called culture war that we are seemingly in the midst of, right? Like within our own country, people are at each other's throats, and it seems like the war, it might not be like a civil war in the classical sense, but there is. I feel like, at least from my vantage point, we're certainly in the midst of what seems like an ideological war.
Yeah, we are, and I think most people are sick of it, right? You get these. There's a lot of reasons. One is you get these extreme voices on either side, and they're the ones that get a lot of attention. Probably most of us just feel like, hey, can't we all just get along? I know that's a trite
That's how
phrase.
I feel.
Yeah, that's how I feel as well. Part of it, I think, has to do with really the breakdown of traditional community and the fact that it is very easy to find a community online, and these algorithms, they group you with someone who has the same views. And so it's easier now for people with fairly extreme views to find themselves in a chat room or some other virtual space with other people who have those same extreme views, and they start to get the sense that most people share my view because they found like half a dozen people online who do, and so everyone who doesn't is crazy and whatnot. And there has been a decline in community participation over the last several decades. Robert Putnam at Harvard has documented this probably better than anyone. He has this influential book called Bowling Alone, which documented the decline of bowling leagues, not just bowling leagues, but civic organizations, churches, synagogues, and so forth. And if these algorithms are sorting us online into virtual communities based on our political viewpoints, especially extreme ones, then we're not going to be rubbing shoulders with people who disagree on these fundamental issues. And therefore, we see them as less human because we don't have human interaction with them. We subconsciously
like echo chambers.
Well, yeah. I'm describing echo chambers, and if you don't know someone personally who has a disagreeing viewpoint, you're more likely to dehumanize that other viewpoint, the people that hold that other viewpoint. And so we need to somehow find ways. I mean, this happens all over. In academics is at a very interesting time right now with the October 7th, war that essentially erupted between Palestine and Israel. Academic administrators who previously were very okay, making political statements are now saying, we have a policy of neutrality. We're not going to get in the midst of this because now they have substantial portions of people on both sides of these issues, and they're trying to figure out, okay, we need to figure out a way that we can interact in person with people who have fundamentally different viewpoints than ours. And our psychology is such that in ways we're hardwired to form these tribes. But it is possible to redraw that circle even larger and to say, look, let's focus on the shared humanity, what we do have in common, even if it's small to start out with, and go from there.
Do you think? I mean, it's occasionally referred to as, I think, like luxury beliefs. Do you think the fact that there is no real sense of an external enemy, that it's allowed these like luxury anxieties, if you will, to kind of foment?
I'm trying to remember where that phrase comes from. It's this memoir by Henderson. Is that Rob Henderson? I think he came out with a book a couple months ago, and he kind of, I'm not sure if he coined that phrase. That may be part of it, but I don't think that's all of it, because we do have external enemies. Some might not think of them that way, but the world is not at peace by any stretch. Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's been over 2 years ago, right? And most Americans view that as a really frightening thing. So if that were the only reason, then probably Russia invading Ukraine would have unified us. But there's something, I think, additional going on that is, that is unfortunately chipping away at kind of the soul of our civic body.
So how do we fix this situation?
I wish I had the answer to that question. I don't know.
Ketamine for everybody?
I'm not going to recommend that. I think part of it has to do with, we need to learn again how to disagree better. We're not going to get everyone on the same side of these really important and controversial issues. We need to learn how to disagree better and how to be okay going to work, working alongside, living next to someone who has very different political viewpoints than us. I think that's critical if we are going to maintain this experiment in democracy, that we need to be able to disagree better.
Yeah, so true. So how can we harness the insights presented in your new book, Purpose, specifically, to increase happiness and to live longer, live better? Because, again, today, midst of a mental health crisis, we've inherited a world that presents innumerable stressors, right? Like from the toxic food supply, I think 50% of people don't exercise. We're living in difficult times. So how can we harness the insights from your book to on an individual level, right?
Yeah.
Like people listening to this, to live better.
Yeah. Certainly there's a lot of potential. There's not a cure-all for everything. One of the insights that I'm trying to bring is, where does love come from in a biological sense? And that may sound like a funny question, but the way that nature shaped us, the better aspects of human nature have come from the way that nature has shaped our relationships. And so much of this has to do with the way that it has shaped our family relationships. So I'm going to draw upon the work of a psychiatrist named John Bowlby, who essentially laid out this framework called attachment theory. So John Bowlby he was born in the early 1900s, died in the late 1900s. And he came about at a time when the prevailing sentiment in psychology and other social sciences was that relationships were not very important. They were kind of a means to an end. Okay, that's a very transactional and superficial way. Now we know that's frankly wrong. But he didn't buy that, and he was kind of searching for a theory to kind of help understand and unify what he saw was a critical part of human existence, which is relationships. And he traced that to the root of the parent-child interaction. So he noticed, among others, that human offspring, when they are born, are incredibly helpless. Okay, they are utterly immature. In fact, some scholars of human nature refer to the first, say, 3 to 6 months of a baby's life as the, quote, fourth trimester, because in essence we are born half-baked. And there's potential reasons for this. I do get into a little bit in the book, but as a result, and by the way, we're the creature that is kind of most at this end of the spectrum. There are some creatures, like a foal can walk within a few days of being born. A giraffe can walk within a few days. They have some dependence on their parents for a time, but we are kind of the extreme. And in a way that's good. In a way that's tricky. John Bowlby noticed that basically everything a baby can do, like cry, coo, laugh, smile, cry, and so forth, is meant to draw the parent close to the child. And this is adaptive. He couched this in an evolutionary framework. This was necessary for the child to survive. And as a result, on the part of the parent, there has to be a deep love and care and concern for the child. And fortunately, generally, Mother Nature cooperates. And for those of us who have children, especially a first child, it is a life-changing experience. A lot of parents will describe it as an experience where you just didn't know that level of love you could even fathom or feel that. And that this is at the root of attachment theory, which, by the way, Bowlby has theorized, and most of the data show this, that relationship, that primary relationship between infant and most of the time it's mother, serve as the basis for your psychological architecture to make all other relationships and form all other relationships in life. And so I don't want to get myself in trouble, but we have moved away from an ethic of family and children and raising children, and we have focused a little bit, I think, too much on what can I get out of life? What is how do we measure our success? And a lot of us point to cars, salaries, jobs, positions, status, and so forth. And it turns out that the data is pretty compelling that these things may, for a period, give us some sense of satisfaction, but it tends to be fleeting. And especially if these things take you away from family relationships, they can lead you in a direction where you end up and you're like, how did I get here? And I'm not feeling the way I hoped I would be feeling. So what I try to pull out here and staying as close to the science as I can is, from a biological and psychological perspective, the strongest forms of love were shaped in the ways that parents related to their children. And by the way, it's interesting because say you have like 10 parents and you ask them what's the most rewarding thing you've done. 9 out of 10 times they'll say, raise my kid. And if you also ask them, hey, what's the most challenging thing you've ever done? 9 out of 10 times they will say, raise my kid. And you can't get away from that, right? Because from an evolutionary perspective, you can't take those things away. The deep love that was required is because of that extreme immaturity and the investment that you have to put into your child. And you as far as I'm concerned, you can't separate those two. You can't have deep love without compelling sacrifice. That's like an almost like cosmic or spiritual kind of principle. Let me just, if you don't mind, drive this point home. Imagine how our social lives would be different if we were seahorses. Okay, now seahorses are obviously different than us in a number of ways. One of the ways is that the males give birth. Okay, this is obviously, we'd end up with some very different parental leave policies if this were the case. But seahorses, once their babies are born, they don't have any parental investment, meaning they don't really care for their kids. It's kind of like they're born and they go off and it's like, good luck, make me proud, I hope you don't get eaten, right? So no human being knows what it's like exactly to be a seahorse, but it's a good bet that they don't feel a deep love and care and concern for their children because they didn't have to. They have a different kind of strategy, survivalist strategy. They give birth to like 2,000 kids at once. And because there's so many of them, enough survive that they can kind of get away with that sort of strategy. Whereas us, we have one, maybe on occasion, twins, 2 babies at a time, rare instances 3, but we have relatively few offspring, but we have to invest incredibly heavily in rearing these children and so forth. And parenting, I'm fortunate. I have 5 children. It's a mess. It's a wonderful mess. But I'll tell you what I'm not is on any given day I'm not lonely. Right? I go home. Things are chaotic. My wife she's a saint because she puts up with me first and foremost. But things are often crazy. But I am not lonely, and that is telling because everyone agrees that we're in a mental health crisis, right? And there's a lot of disagreement as to why. But one of the things that people have been pointing to, the U.S. Surgeon General almost a year ago put out this kind of statement on the epidemic of loneliness, right? That we are kind of struggling through. And that has been, I think, because we have been focusing too much on our individual striving and status and so forth, and not enough on, okay, how can I make my relationships better? And that's always a give and take, right? I mean, relationships are tricky because you have 2 people, and in a marriage, like it's so easy to see the fault in your partner, but you can't do anything about it. You can't change your partner, right? That when I have patients who are struggling in their marriage or other relationship, they say it's so clear. I can see this person needs to change X, Y, Z. And they say, okay, well, but you can't change that for them. The only thing you can do is point to your own weaknesses and overcome them. So it's so easy to see the weaknesses in others, but so hard to see it in ourselves, right? I mean, this is classic, just deep wisdom of Jesus, who said, don't look to take out the splinter that is in your neighbor's eye, but first remove the log that is in your own eye. Right? It's just a deep truth of human nature.
Deep truth, yeah. We've had Robert Waldinger on the show in the past, who compared loneliness to a toxin on par with alcohol or cigarettes, like smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, there is data. It's often cited that loneliness is about as deadly for even your physical health as obesity or smoking cigarettes. So I agree with him in that respect. There's lots of data. It's interesting because we don't exactly understand the mechanisms behind this, how the relationships enter the brain and interact with the brain. But the research is pretty clear that they do, and they do in a profound way. I mean, that again, talking about the paradoxes, there's the two-edged sword to this is that there's nothing that's going to help your mental health more than a positive, warm, intimate relationship. But there's nothing that's going to destroy it more than a toxic one. Yeah. And so, we have this paradox of human nature where things can be so good, but also so bad if they don't unfold or they're not managed properly or what have you.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, I have a very small family, but I have 2 younger brothers, and I relish the fact that we have essentially we're like a gang, we're like a tribe unto ourselves. And that was something that was really important to my parents growing up. My mom, every night we had dinner as a family. She really worked really hard to make sure that we each appreciated one another and that we appreciated the value of family. Yeah. And today my 2 younger brothers are my best friends, Yeah. I love spending time with them. It's incredible. But what about for people who maybe don't have family, that don't have kids, that don't want kids, that maybe are unable to have kids? Mm-hmm. What can they do?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different groups you just named off there. This is a hard thing for some people. A lot of people do not come from warm and nurturing families. The good thing, at least in principle, is that even if you can't choose the family you're from, you can influence the family you form. So for people who, for whatever reason, come from these difficult circumstances, things can change. You can right the ship, even in a single generation. And, there's lots of self-help books, lots of good resources to, how do I get better at relationships? But it is a source of heartache, and I understand that. But I also can't say, well, relationships don't matter, because they clearly do. Again, for better and for worse. For those people who, I don't want to be presumptuous. For those people who don't want children, there's a variety of reasons that might be. I guess I would maybe provide some perspective that if the reason you don't want kids is that you just want to enjoy life or something, there may be other circumstances. Again, I want to be really careful about this, but if you purposefully avoid that, then you may be missing out on what is the profoundest joys of life, and really the way that evolution shaped us is that parent-child interaction. Although it is extremely challenging, it is immensely rewarding. I know there's lots of other reasons, finances, that sort of thing. Those all need to be taken into consideration. But if you have a great partner, or maybe a great spouse, and it's just like, well, I'm too busy, you're never going to be not busy. You're never going to be, if you wait to have a kid until you're ready, you'll never have a kid, because you're never ready. It is a, for me at least, and the surveys and the data and so forth more or less confirm this, that it can be really a life-changing experience.
Recently, there was a clip that went viral featuring Seth Rogen. Are you familiar with him?
I know vaguely. I mean, he's an actor.
Yeah, he's an actor. We actually know each other by way of his lovely wife, Lauren. They're both powerful advocates for Alzheimer's disease awareness, and that's kind of the my access point to the family. But he was on a podcast or something recently, and he shared that he and his wife, they every night they smoke weed together, they hang out together, they've got this beautiful loving relationship, and he just has no desire to have kids. He's obviously very successful, very wealthy, adored the world over, and that clip went kind of viral on social media, with people kind of tearing it apart, and I have no perspective on it. I'm no judgments. But yeah, I just thought it was funny, the degree of reaction that it got from people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's important to withhold judgment, right? You see you don't know everyone's reasons for things. Maybe people can't. Maybe they've tried, or they can't, but certainly also to pay attention to the data. It is a remarkably transformative process. The process of having a child, of raising a child. It's not for the faint of heart. I'm not saying that everyone should do it.
It's so challenging.
It is.
I mean, I don't have kids. I do want kids eventually, but my little brother, he's the first in my family to have had kids, and he's got two little girls now at this point. And they're beautiful, and they're so fun. They're adorable. The love is just palpable. I show up at my brother's house, and the little girl, she's like Kayla. She's like 18 months old. She comes over to me. She gives me a big hug. It's the sweetest thing. I've never seen anything like it. But it is also so incredibly challenging. I mean, I can see it.
You can't get away from those two. I don't think you can disconnect them. This reminds me when I was an intern. It's your first year after medical school, and we went to this party. At that point, I had two kids. Our first kids were twins. So that was like, welcome to parenting. Here's two for one.
Here's two of them.
That was, my wife is a saint. But we went to this party where, some of my colleagues were there, and my daughters, at that point, they were about 3.5 or so. And one of my colleagues, most doctors at that age don't have kids. I was a little bit of an early parent. But he was just so blown away with how happy they were, because they're just brimming with excitement and joy and so forth. And he was like, I wish I could be happy about anything to that level. and there is that, you probably have experienced that when you go visit your brother and his family, again, as long as kind of the basic needs are being met and so forth, the kids are just resilient. They're full of life, and it's a wonderful thing. It's a challenging thing.
Super challenging.
Yeah.
Relationships, they're crucially important.
Yeah.
Communities like church, synagogue.
Yeah.
Are there any that you know of, any even remotely close stand-ins if you don't yet have kids, or if you can't have kids, because some people can't.
Being part of, the extended family, if you can. Again, I know these days it is unfortunate, and going back to this, the way that politics seems to have divided us, there's between younger and older generations. Please do your best. Don't let different political viewpoints destroy a relationship in your family. You've got to figure out ways. Don't talk about it, whatever, but don't let those things divide you. It's not worth it. And so stand-ins, extended family, church and other community groups are great resources. We don't talk about it enough in mental health, but there's a lot of compelling data that religious participation is a huge protector of mental health and can lead people to have a sense of meaning and joy and a lot of this, it's nothing necessarily magical, but it ties them to a community of other people, and it helps them be a part of something that is bigger than just themselves. You can get that from secular organizations as well. There seems to be, however, something about ritual and a kind of belief in the divine that maybe does a little bit more to tie people together than maybe a purely secular thing. But secular organizations also can be a very important sense of meaning and tie into relationships with other people in the community.
Does it have to be a belief in the divine, or can it just be belief in something larger than yourself?
Well, I guess I would say yes. So
because a lot of people, say that's why we have sports, right?
Yeah.
Because people rally around this shared adoration for a team. It's like when you go to a sports game, it's like, I'm not saying it's a one-to-one replacement for a religious experience, but it's like a lot of people go to the Super Bowl and they feel that shared sense of communion, that shared sense of awe and wonder that there is definitely overlap with what I think a lot of people experience. I've never been a religious person, but that's what I.
There certainly is an overlap. The way that I understand stress and depression and so forth leads me to believe that there is a protective mechanism in addition to just the shared community of religious belief, and that if you think that, look, there is a loving and benevolent God, even if you can't quite square that with why is there suffering, then that if you actually believe that, if you hold to that belief, that will confer upon you more resilience. So for instance, we talk a lot about stress in psychiatry. There's this sense that stress is bad, right? It's not that simple. Some stress is good in that if it's brief and of short duration and not too intense, that's what we call a challenge. And if you overcome a challenge, you have more self-confidence, and you can therefore overcome an even larger challenge next time. Now, there's not like a set amount of time or level of intensity. It varies for each person. But if you can conceptualize a challenge or a stress, different ways to describe the same thing, as this is something that for whatever reason the God or the divine source thinks that I can handle and overcome, then that level of duration just got a little bit longer, or that level of intensity just got a little bit higher. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly I think there's benefit from the community part to it. But even, a lot of people these days, they say I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. There is some benefit just to that as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, who is Purpose written for? What do people viewers, listeners stand to gain from picking up your book?
I mainly wrote this book for people who have the sense that, look, life does have some meaning and purpose, but how does that square with what previously to me was a sort of kind of mindless or godless or random theory of evolution? And so if you have some sense that, look, there is something more than just maybe what we see, but you're not sure how that squares with science, then I hope this book is specifically for you.
I love it. And you're a man of the cloth and a man of science. You're a rare breed.
Yeah, hopefully it will be more common in the next little bit.
Yeah, I love it. So cool. Well, thanks for coming in. I've got one last question for you, but before we get to that, where can people find your book and where can they connect with you? Are you on social media?
I'm not. I don't have a big presence on social media. I have my Yale webpage. You can just look for my name, Samuel Wilkinson, Yale. I do have a personal professional website, mainly launched for the book, SamuelTWilkinson.com. You can connect with me there. And
you have a blog on Psychology Today?
I have a new blog on psychologytoday.com.
That's funny. I actually have a blog on Psychology Today as well. Yeah, I haven't blogged.
There's thousands of us.
Yeah.
A lot of authors.
I haven't blogged in years, but that's cool to know. Last question that gets asked everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
I think living a genius life means understanding all of us have cognitive illusions that are baked into us. We are not very good. Psychologists call this affective forecasting. We're not very good at predicting how we're going to feel in a certain way, in a certain situation, And by consequence, we're not that great at predicting what's going to make us happy. And this is one of the reasons that we kind of continually sabotage our lives, is because what we think will make us happy turns out not necessarily to be the case. So I think a genius life is having a good understanding of maybe ancient wisdom and modern science to help us understand what makes a good life.
I love that. It reminds me of a quote from Alex Hormozy. Are you familiar with him at all?
I'm not.
He's like a social media phenom, but I think this is accurately attributable to him, but he says you've already achieved things that you thought would make you happy.
Yeah.
So why aren't you happy?
It has to do with the cognitive illusions that we have, right? I mean, a couple months ago, I was at a training. This was a small group of about 15 of us who were Yale faculty, and the training was to help us be better faculty and get a lot of grant funding and publications and stuff. And towards the end of this 2-day seminar, again, small group, there were 15 or so of us. They asked, what is your ultimate dream? And at first everyone's kind of humble and like, and then one person said, I want to win a Nobel Prize. Another person said, I want to be a university dean, which is a pretty powerful position in universities. And that just got me thinking, why is it that we do what we do? And a lot of times mostly it's because we want to feel good. We want to be happy. And say you did win a Nobel Prize tomorrow, you are going to feel good, but it's not going to last. It's going to be maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month, that sort of thing. So I think understanding that we have, our psychologies were not fashioned in a period of abundance. And so we're not prepared very well to live in a time where we have, at least in the United States, for most people, fortunately, relative abundance of food and so forth. And so we keep saying, I just need more stuff. I need more things, whatever. And as I forget the name of this guy, he said, you've already done that, but you're not where you thought you would be. So we have these cognitive illusions that are built within us, and we need to. For me, this is one of the reasons I go to church, is because it helps remind me what is important, and it's my relationships with my family, with other people, for me, with God. It's a powerful thing.
Powerful indeed. Thanks for coming in, Doc.
Thanks.
Yeah, this was super fun.
It's been great to be here. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Of course. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.